Welcome to True Crime Department. Thanks for your support. Stay tuned for gripping true crime stories. Don't forget to subscribe. Martha Hoffman had always believed in second chances. At 67 years old, she had lived through enough disappointments to understand that life rarely followed the script you wrote for it. Her first marriage had ended in her early 30s, leaving her to raise her daughter alone while working double shifts as a hospital administrator in Stuttgart. Those years had been hard, lonely even, but they had also been hers. She had built a career, purchased a modest apartment, and watched her daughter grow into a successful architect, now living in Munich with her own family. Then, at 59, Martha met Klaus Weber at a charity fundraiser for cancer research. He was recently widowed, still grieving the loss of his wife of 30 years, and seemed as surprised as she was to find himself laughing again. Klaus had been a mechanical engineer before retiring, a practical man who approached problems with methodical precision. He wore sensible sweaters, drove a 15-year-old Volkswagen, and never ordered dessert at restaurants because he considered it wasteful. Martha found his frugality endearing at first, a welcome contrast to the careless spending of her first husband. Their courtship was gentle and unhurried. They took long walks through the Schlossgarten, attended classical concerts at the Liederhalle, and discovered they both enjoyed historical documentaries and crossword puzzles. Klaus had 2 grown sons from his previous marriage, both living abroad, one in Canada and the other in Australia. They spoke occasionally, but visits were rare. Martha understood the geography of fractured families. She knew how distance, both physical and emotional, could create chasms that seemed impossible to bridge. They married in a small ceremony at the Stuttgart registry office 8 months after they met. Martha's daughter attended with her husband and their 2 children, while Klaus's sons sent congratulatory messages but did not make the trip. It stung, Martha could tell, though Klaus said nothing about it. He simply nodded when she squeezed his hand and suggested they take a honeymoon to Lake Constance instead of dwelling on absences. The first years of their marriage settled into a comfortable rhythm. They moved into Klaus's larger apartment in Bad Cannstatt, a decision made primarily for practical reasons, since his place had an extra bedroom for when Martha's grandchildren visited. The apartment was dated, with floral wallpaper from the 1980s and heavy oak furniture that Klaus refused to replace because it was still functional. Martha had wanted to redecorate, to bring in lighter colors and more modern pieces, but Klaus became agitated whenever she mentioned it. "Why spend money we don't need to spend?" he would ask, his voice taking on an edge that surprised her. "There's nothing wrong with what we have," so she let it go. Marriage was about compromise after all, and Klaus was good to her in other ways. He made coffee every morning, exactly the way she liked it. He never forgot their anniversary. He accompanied her to doctor's appointments and held her hand during the mammogram results she dreaded each year. These gestures mattered more than furniture, she told herself, but there were moments when Martha felt a strange distance growing between them, a coolness she couldn't quite name. Klaus had always been reserved about money, but as the years passed, his frugality intensified into something that felt more like control. He managed their joint account with rigid discipline, questioning every purchase Martha made, even small ones. A new coat for winter became an interrogation about whether her old one was truly unwearable. Dinner with friends required justification about the cost per person. When Martha suggested they finally take that trip to Italy they had talked about, Klaus dismissed it immediately, citing their fixed incomes and the irresponsibility of travel expenses. Martha began to feel less like a wife and more like someone seeking permission for her own life. She tried to talk to him about it once, choosing her words carefully over breakfast, explaining that she felt constrained, that she had worked hard all her life and deserved to enjoy her retirement without constant worry about spending. Klaus had looked at her with genuine confusion, as if she were speaking a foreign language. "I'm protecting us," he said flatly. "Someone has to be responsible." The conversation ended there, And Martha learned not to bring it up again. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Klaus's fixation on money ran deeper than simple frugality. His first wife had come from a wealthy family, and though Klaus never spoke about it, he had spent 3 decades living in her shadow, dependent on her family's generosity for the comfortable lifestyle they maintained. When she died, the money went to their sons, as it should have, but Klaus found himself suddenly reduced to his modest pension and the small apartment he had inherited. He had tasted wealth and lost it, and the bitterness of that loss had calcified into something harder than grief. Then came the phone call that would change everything. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring when Martha answered the phone in their kitchen, expecting her daughter, or perhaps the pharmacy confirming a prescription. Instead, she heard the formal, slightly nasal voice of Dr. Heinrich Bauer, an attorney from Freiburg. Her uncle Conrad, her mother's much older brother whom she hadn't seen in over 20 years, had passed away at the age of 93. He had never married, had no children, and had named Martha as his sole heir. The inheritance was substantial. Uncle Conrad had been a successful vintner in Baden-Württemberg, and his estate included a profitable vineyard, a large house in the countryside, several investment properties, and liquid assets that totaled approximately 3.7 million euros. The lawyer explained the details methodically, his voice betraying no emotion as he outlined the various holdings, the necessary paperwork, and the timeline for transferring ownership. Martha sat down heavily in a kitchen chair, her hand trembling as she held the phone. She had barely known her uncle, remembered him only as a stern figure at family gatherings decades ago, someone who spoke little and drank good wine. She certainly never expected this. When she told Klaus, his reaction was immediate and intense. His eyes widened, and for the first time in years, Martha saw genuine animation in his face. He asked her to repeat the amount, then asked again, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. 3.7 million euros, he repeated slowly, testing the words in his mouth. Then he smiled, a wide, hungry smile that Martha had never seen before, and pulled her into an embrace that felt more like possession than affection. That night, Klaus opened a bottle of wine they had been saving for a special occasion, and they sat in their dated living room, discussing the inheritance late into the evening. Klaus was suddenly full of plans. They could sell the vineyard and the properties, invest the money wisely, live comfortably for the rest of their lives. They could finally travel, he said, contradicting years of refusing her suggestions to do exactly that. They could help Martha's daughter buy a bigger house. They could even consider moving themselves, perhaps to somewhere with better weather, maybe Spain or Portugal. Martha listened, nodding along, but something felt off. The enthusiasm in Klaus's voice wasn't joy exactly. It was something else, something that made her uneasy, though she couldn't articulate why. She noticed how he kept saying we, but seemed to be planning their future without actually asking what she wanted. When she mentioned that she needed to think carefully about what to do with the vineyard, that perhaps she wanted to visit Freiburg and see her uncle's property before making any decisions. Klaus's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, he said smoothly. We should visit together. Make decisions together. That's what marriage is about. But the word together sounded strange coming from him, weighted with something Martha couldn't identify. She went to bed that night with a knot in her stomach, though she told herself she was being foolish. This was good news. This was life-changing money. This was security and freedom. So why did she feel like she had just stepped into something dangerous? In the weeks that followed, Martha began the process of managing the inheritance with Dr. Bauer. The legal work was complex, requiring multiple trips to Freiburg and countless documents. Klaus insisted on accompanying her to every meeting, sitting beside her as the lawyer explained trusts and tax implications and property values. He asked detailed questions, took careful notes, and afterwards would spend hours at their kitchen table calculating figures and possibilities. What Martha didn't realize was that Klaus was also calculating something else entirely. In his mind, A plan was beginning to form, cold and clear as winter ice. The inheritance was in Martha's name. Legally, it belonged to her alone, since it predated their marriage and came from her family. If something were to happen to Martha, the money would pass according to her will, which currently left everything to her daughter, unless, of course, that will were changed. And even if it weren't, as Martha's husband, Klaus would certainly be entitled to a significant portion, especially if her death was sudden and tragic. Klaus began researching inheritance laws with the same methodical precision he had once applied to engineering problems. He spent hours online when Martha was visiting her daughter or shopping, reading legal forums and articles about spousal rights and estate distribution. He learned that in Germany, a surviving spouse was entitled to a statutory portion of the estate, regardless of what the will said, typically 1/4 of the total value. But if he could convince Martha to update her will to include him more substantially, that percentage would increase dramatically. He started gently, mentioning over dinner one evening that they should both update their wills now that their financial situation had changed so significantly. Just to protect each other, he said reasonably. To make sure everything is handled properly if something happens to either of us. Martha agreed it made sense, though she hadn't gotten around to actually doing it yet. Klaus didn't push, at least not overtly. He simply mentioned it again every few weeks, carefully, persistently, like water wearing away stone. But as spring turned to summer and the inheritance finalized, Klaus's impatience grew. Martha still hadn't updated her will. She had mentioned wanting to set up a trust for her grandchildren to ensure they had money for university and their futures. She talked about donating to the hospital where she had worked for so many years, perhaps funding a scholarship for nursing students. These were her plans, her decisions, and Klaus felt his control slipping away with each conversation. He began to see Martha differently now, not as his wife, but as an obstacle between him and the life he believed he deserved. The bitterness that had lived in him since his first wife's death bloomed into something darker. He had been patient for so long, had lived modestly and carefully, and here was his chance at comfort, at security, at the wealth he had lost. He just needed Martha out of the way. The plan came to him during one of their weekend hikes in the Black Forest, a routine they had maintained throughout their marriage. Klaus had always enjoyed hiking, the solitude of the trails and the physical exertion that cleared his mind. Martha joined him dutifully, though she was slowing down now, her knees bothering her more with each passing year. As they walked along a narrow path that skirted a steep drop, Klaus found himself thinking how easy it would be for someone to lose their footing, to stumble and fall. How such accidents happened all the time, especially to elderly hikers. How no one would question it. The thought should have horrified him, but instead it settled into his mind with disturbing clarity. He began to refine it, to consider the logistics. They would need to be alone, on a difficult trail, somewhere isolated. The fall would need to be significant enough to be fatal, and his reaction would need to be perfect, grief-stricken and shocked. Exactly what people would expect from a devoted husband who had just watched his wife die in a tragic accident. Klaus looked at Martha as she walked ahead of him, slightly out of breath, her grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and felt nothing but cold calculation. She had become a problem to solve, and he was very good at solving problems. Martha, meanwhile, remained unaware of the darkness taking root in her husband's mind. She was preoccupied with her own concerns, trying to navigate the complex emotions that came with sudden wealth. She felt guilty about the money, unsure whether she deserved it, worried about how it might change her relationships. She talked to her daughter about these feelings, about the weight of unexpected fortune and the responsibility it carried. But she never talked to Klaus about her deeper fears, about the unease that had been growing in her marriage long before the inheritance arrived. She told herself she was overreacting, that Klaus was simply being Klaus, practical and careful. She didn't want to admit, even to herself, that she had begun to feel afraid of her own husband. The change in Klaus was subtle at first, so gradual that Martha almost convinced herself she was imagining it. He became more attentive, almost solicitous, asking about her day with renewed interest, offering to cook dinner more frequently, suggesting they spend more time together. To anyone observing from the outside, Klaus Weber appeared to be a husband deeply appreciative of his wife and their improved circumstances. But Martha felt the performance in it, the calculated quality of his affection that reminded her of someone following a script. In early August, Klaus proposed they take a hiking trip to celebrate the finalization of the inheritance. He had researched a beautiful trail in the Swabian Alps, he explained, a place called the Albtrauf, with spectacular views and challenging terrain. It would be good for them, he insisted, a chance to reconnect away from the stress of lawyers and paperwork and decisions about money. Martha hesitated. Her knees had been aching more lately, and the idea of a strenuous hike felt exhausting rather than appealing. But Klaus pressed gently, reminding her that they used to hike every weekend, that physical activity was important for maintaining health at their age, that they should celebrate this new chapter in their lives. She agreed, partly because refusing seemed like it would require an explanation she didn't have, and partly because she still wanted to believe that everything was fine, that her unease was simply her own anxiety about change, rather than intuition warning her of danger. Klaus began planning the trip with meticulous attention to detail. He studied maps of the area, marked the specific trail he wanted to take, and checked weather forecasts obsessively. He purchased new hiking boots for both of them, high-quality ones that he said would provide better ankle support on rocky terrain. He packed their backpacks days in advance, including first aid supplies, water bottles, energy bars, and his phone fully charged in case of emergency. To Martha, it seemed like excessive preparation for a day hike, but Klaus had always been thorough. She tried to find comfort in his carefulness, rather than questioning it. What Martha didn't see was Klaus studying the topographical maps late at night after she had gone to bed, identifying the steepest sections of the trail, the places where the path ran closest to significant drops. She didn't know that he had driven to the Swabian Alps alone 2 weeks earlier, hiking the trail by himself to scout the location, to find the perfect spot where an accident would seem not just possible, but probable. He had stood at the edge of a particularly treacherous section, where the path narrowed to less than a meter wide, with a sheer cliff face on one side and a drop of nearly 40 meters on the other. And he had smiled. The section was isolated, far enough from the parking area that they were unlikely to encounter other hikers, especially on a weekday morning. The ground was loose gravel mixed with limestone, naturally slippery. There were no guardrails, no warning signs, just the raw edge of the mountain. Klaus had even practiced the motion, the quick shove that would need to look like an instinctive grab that came too late. The stumble that any grieving husband might make in a desperate attempt to save his falling wife. As the date of the hike approached, Martha found herself sleeping poorly, waking in the early hours, with her heart racing for reasons she couldn't name. She would lie in the darkness, listening to Klaus's steady breathing beside her, and feel utterly alone. Once she almost called her daughter, almost confessed that something felt wrong, that she was afraid, though she didn't know of what exactly. But it seemed absurd to articulate. What would she say? That her husband was being too nice? That planning a hike felt sinister? She would sound paranoid, irrational, like an old woman losing her grip on reality. Klaus, meanwhile, felt increasingly confident. He had run through every scenario, anticipated every possible complication. He had even practiced his reaction, standing in front of the bathroom mirror and letting his face crumple into appropriate horror, testing different versions of the scream he would emit, the way he would collapse to his knees and sob. It needed to be convincing but not theatrical, genuine shock combined with overwhelming grief. He had studied videos of people receiving tragic news, noting their body language and expressions. The night before the hike, Klaus prepared a special dinner. He opened an expensive bottle of wine from Martha's inherited vineyard, poured generous glasses, and toasted to their future together. Martha noticed he kept refilling her glass, encouraging her to drink more than usual, and she wondered if he was trying to impair her coordination for the next day. The thought flickered through her mind, and she immediately pushed it away as ridiculous. Klaus was her husband. He was celebrating with her, not plotting against her. But she quietly poured half her glass into a potted plant when he went to the kitchen, and she saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly when he returned and noticed her nearly empty glass. That night, Martha barely slept. She lay in bed with Klaus's arm draped across her waist, feeling trapped rather than embraced. Around 3 in the morning, she got up and went to the living room, sitting in the darkness and trying to calm her racing thoughts. She found herself thinking about the inheritance, about how much money it was, about who would get it if something happened to her. Her will still left everything to her daughter. Klaus would receive his statutory portion as her surviving spouse, roughly a quarter of the estate, but the rest would go to her daughter and grandchildren as she intended, unless Klaus had other plans, unless he had been working on her to change that will for a reason. Martha's hands began to tremble as the pieces arranged themselves in her mind with terrible clarity. His sudden attentiveness, his insistence on this hike, his detailed planning, his questions about her will. She stood up abruptly, her breath coming fast, and for a moment considered packing a bag and leaving, going to her daughter's house in Munich, anywhere but here. But where was the proof? What did she actually know? That her husband wanted to go hiking? That he was interested in their financial future? That he had been asking about estate planning? None of it was evidence of anything except her own paranoid imagination. She had no concrete reason to believe Klaus would hurt her. Only a feeling, an instinct, the accumulated weight of small moments that might mean nothing at all. Martha stood in the dark living room, caught between her intuition screaming danger and her rational mind demanding proof she didn't have. Finally, she went back to bed, lying rigid beside Klaus, until dawn broke grey and cold through the windows. When the alarm went off at 6, Klaus woke immediately, energized and focused. He smiled at Martha, kissed her forehead, and told her he had already packed the car. They would leave within the hour. Martha got dressed slowly, her hands shaking as she tied her new hiking boots. She looked at herself in the mirror, at her 67-year-old face lined with years of work and worry, and now something else, something that looked like fear. She could refuse to go. She could fake illness. She could call her daughter right now and ask her to come get her. But she did none of these things. Instead, she picked up her backpack, walked to the kitchen where Klaus was waiting with coffee and forced enthusiasm, and got into the car. As they drove south toward the Swabian Alps, Klaus talked cheerfully about the beautiful weather and the stunning views they would see. Martha stared out the window, watching the landscape change from city to countryside to the dramatic limestone cliffs rising in the distance. She tried to convince herself that everything would be fine, that they would hike and return home, and she would laugh about her foolish fears. But deep down, in a place beyond rational thought, Martha Hoffman knew that she was driving towards something terrible, and she had no idea how to stop it. They arrived at the trailhead parking area just before 9 in the morning. The lot was nearly empty, only 2 other vehicles visible, both likely belonging to serious hikers who had started at dawn. Klaus parked at the far end, away from the other cars, explaining that the shade would keep the vehicle cooler. Martha nodded, but noticed how isolated their car would be, how no one would see them arriving or departing. Another small detail that fit the pattern her mind was now tracking with horrible clarity. Klaus retrieved their backpacks from the trunk with practiced efficiency, checking the contents one final time before shouldering his own and helping Martha with hers. His movements were calm and methodical, betraying none of the adrenaline that was flooding his system. This was it. After weeks of planning, of careful preparation, the moment had finally arrived. He felt oddly detached, as if he were watching himself from a distance. an engineer overseeing a complex operation. The trail began gently enough, winding through dense forest with dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Martha focused on her breathing, on placing one foot carefully in front of the other, trying to quiet the alarm bells ringing in her mind. Birds sang in the trees. The air smelled of pine and earth. Everything appeared peaceful, ordinary, exactly like the hundreds of hikes they had taken over the years. Perhaps she really was being paranoid. Perhaps Klaus had simply wanted to do something nice for them. But as they climbed higher and the trees began to thin, Klaus's demeanor shifted subtly. He stopped making casual conversation, his responses to Martha's comments becoming brief and distracted. He kept checking his watch and glancing up the trail as if looking for something specific. Martha felt her pulse quicken. They had been hiking for nearly 40 minutes, and she knew from experience that Klaus had planned their route carefully. Whatever he had in mind, they were approaching it. The path narrowed as they emerged onto an exposed ridge. On their left, the mountain rose steeply. On their right, the ground dropped away sharply, offering spectacular views of the valley below, but also a terrifying void of empty air and jagged rocks far beneath. The trail itself was barely wide enough for one person, the surface a treacherous mix of loose gravel and exposed limestone. Martha stopped, her breath catching not from exertion but from fear. "Klaus, this looks dangerous," she said, hearing the tremor in her voice. "Maybe we should turn back. Find an easier route." Klaus turned to face her, and for a brief moment, Martha saw something flicker across his features, something cold and predatory that vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. Then his expression softened into concern. "It looks worse than it is," he said reassuringly. "I researched this trail extensively. People hike it all the time. Just stay close to the mountainside and watch your footing. I'll go first to make sure it's safe." He held out his hand, and Martha stared at it as if it were a snake. Every instinct screamed at her not to take it, not to continue, to turn around right now and practically run back down the mountain. But Klaus was watching her with an expression of patient encouragement, and what could she say? That she thought he was going to push her off a cliff? Based on what evidence? Her fear felt simultaneously overwhelming and absurd. She took his hand. His grip was firm, almost too firm, and he pulled her forward onto the narrow section of trail. They moved slowly, Klaus in front and Martha behind him, their backs pressed against the rocky mountain face. Martha kept her eyes fixed on Klaus's shoulders ahead of her, refusing to look down at the drop to her right. Her new hiking boots found purchase on the uneven ground, but she could feel the gravel shifting beneath her feet. Unstable and threatening, they had covered perhaps 20 meters of the exposed section when Klaus suddenly stopped. Martha nearly collided with his back, catching herself at the last moment. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The view," Klaus said, not turning around. "You should see this, Martha. It's magnificent." He stepped aside, pressing himself against the mountain to create space for her to move beside him. The gesture seemed considerate, allowing her to share the view, but Martha understood with crystal clarity what was actually happening. Klaus was positioning her on the outside edge, where the path was narrowest, where the drop was most severe. If she moved forward to stand beside him, she would be vulnerable, exposed, with nothing but air and a fatal fall to her right. Martha didn't move. She stood frozen, her fingernails digging into the rough limestone behind her. "Come on," Klaus said, his voice still friendly, but with an undertone of tension now. "You're missing the best part." "I'm fine here," Martha managed, her throat dry. "I don't like heights." Klaus turned to look at her directly, and this time the coldness in his eyes didn't vanish. It stayed there flat and assessing, and Martha knew with absolute certainty that she had been right, that every instinct that had kept her awake the previous night had been accurate. Her husband had brought her here to kill her, Martha, he said quietly, and there was something terrible in how calm he sounded. "You need to come look at this view. That's why we're here." Time seemed to slow and expand. Martha became hyper-aware of every detail. The rough texture of the stone against her palms, the slight breeze that carried the scent of wild thyme, the distant cry of a hawk circling far below them. She looked at Klaus, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing her husband's face. How long had he been planning this? Since the inheritance was finalized? Since she first received the phone call from the lawyer? Or had it started earlier, the potential for this violence always lurking beneath his careful exterior, waiting only for sufficient motivation? No, Martha said, the word coming out stronger than she expected. I'm not going out there. I'm going back. The hike is over. She turned, began to edge backward the way they had come, moving carefully, keeping her body pressed against the mountain. For a moment, she thought Klaus might let her go, that her refusal had disrupted whatever plan he had constructed in his mind. But then she heard him move, heard the scrape of his boots on gravel, and before she could react, his hand clamped around her wrist with crushing force. "You're not going anywhere," Klaus said. And his voice was different now, stripped of all pretense, cold and filled with something like rage. "After everything I've done, everything I've endured, you think I'm going to let you walk away with money that should be mine?" He yanked her forward, trying to pull her off balance toward the edge. Martha screamed, a raw sound of terror and fury, and threw her weight backward, dropping to her knees on the trail. The sudden shift in her center of gravity caught Klaus off guard. His grip on her wrist slipped, and for a crucial second, Martha was free. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, not caring about the rocks cutting into her palms, focused only on getting away from the edge, away from Klaus. He lunged after her, his face twisted with frustration and determination, no longer bothering to hide his intentions. This was no longer about making it look like an accident. This was simply about finishing what he had started. Martha's hand closed around a loose rock, roughly the size of her fist. She didn't think, didn't plan, just swung it upward with all her strength as Klaus reached for her again. The rock connected with his temple with a sickening crack, and Klaus staggered, his eyes going wide with shock. Blood began to stream down the side of his face. He took a stumbling step backward, his boot landing on a patch of loose gravel. And suddenly his expression changed from anger to fear as he felt his footing disappear. Klaus's arms windmilled frantically as he tried to regain his balance, tried to grab onto something, anything. His eyes locked with Martha's for one endless moment, and she saw comprehension there, saw him realize that the trap he had set had closed on him instead. Then gravity claimed him, and he fell backward over the edge with a cry that echoed off the rocks and faded as he dropped toward the valley floor below. Martha lay on the trail, gasping for air, unable to move or think or process what had just happened. The silence that followed Klaus's scream was absolute and terrible. She didn't go to the edge to look down. She couldn't. Instead, she simply lay there trembling violently, staring up at the cloudless sky, while blood from her cut palms mixed with the dust on the ancient stone beneath her. Martha didn't know how long she lay on that trail. Time had become meaningless, reduced to the rhythm of her ragged breathing and the pounding of her heart. Eventually, survival instinct overrode shock. She needed to move. She needed to get help. She pushed herself to sitting position, wincing at the sharp pain in her palms where rocks had cut deep. Her entire body shook uncontrollably, adrenaline still flooding her system, even though the immediate danger had passed. She looked toward the edge once, then immediately looked away, bile rising in her throat. Klaus was down there somewhere, dead certainly. No one survived a fall like that. She had killed her husband. The thought repeated in her mind with strange detachment, as if it were something happening to someone else. "Self-defense," a voice in her head insisted. "He tried to murder you." But another voice whispered, "Who will believe that?" Martha forced herself to stand, legs trembling so badly she had to steady herself against the rock face. Her backpack lay several meters away where it had fallen during the struggle. She retrieved it with mechanical movements, her mind unable to fully engage with what she needed to do next. Call for help. That was the next step. She needed to call the authorities. Her phone was in the side pocket of her backpack. Martha pulled it out with shaking hands and stared at the screen. Signal was weak but present. She dialed 112, the European emergency number, and waited through 3 rings that felt like hours. "Emergency services, what is your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, speaking German with a slight Swabian accent. Martha opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. She tried again, forcing words through her constricted throat. "My husband fell from the trail. In the Swabian Alps, I think he's dead." The dispatcher's tone shifted, becoming more focused. "Where exactly are you located, ma'am?" Martha tried to remember the name of the trail, the specific location Klaus had researched so carefully. "The Albtrauf, near Liechtenstein Castle, I think. There's a narrow section. He fell from there. Are you injured?" "I don't—" "My hands are cut, but I'm okay. He's the one who fell. Can you see him from where you are?" "No, it's too far down. I can't look." The dispatcher asked more questions, patient and methodical, extracting details about their location, the trail markers Martha could see, whether she was in immediate danger. Martha answered automatically, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. The dispatcher told her that mountain rescue was being dispatched, that she should stay where she was if possible, that someone would reach her within approximately 45 minutes. After the call ended, Martha sat down heavily on the trail, well back from the edge, and waited. The sun climbed higher, warming the rocks around her. Birds continued singing as if nothing had happened. The normalcy of it felt obscene. Her husband had just died, had just tried to kill her and died in the attempt, and the world simply continued unchanged. She thought about Klaus's face in that final moment, the fear and comprehension as he realized he was falling. She thought about the coldness in his eyes when he had grabbed her wrist, the rage in his voice when he revealed his true intentions. Which version had been real? The kind man who made her coffee every morning, or the predator who had brought her here to die? Perhaps they had both been real. Perhaps people contained multitudes of selves, good and evil existing simultaneously until circumstances forced one to dominate. The sound of voices eventually pulled Martha from her spiraling thoughts. She called out weakly, and soon 3 members of the mountain rescue team appeared, moving confidently along the narrow trail in their bright orange gear. They approached her with practiced efficiency, one of them immediately kneeling beside her to check her condition while another radioed their position. "I'm okay," Martha said, though tears were streaming down her face now. "It's my husband. He fell. Over there." She gestured vaguely toward the drop. The team leader, a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes, spoke to her gently. "We're going to take care of you first, then we'll handle everything else. Can you tell me what happened?" Martha hesitated. This was the moment. What she said now would determine everything that followed. She could tell the truth, that Klaus had tried to push her and she had fought back and he had fallen. Or she could simplify it, say he lost his footing while they were hiking, that it was a tragic accident. The lie would be easier, cleaner, requiring no explanations about inheritance and murder plots and self-defense. But Martha was tired of lies, tired of pretending, tired of swallowing her truth to make things easier for everyone else. She looked at the rescue team leader and said clearly, "My husband tried to kill me. He brought me here to push me off this cliff. We struggled, and he fell instead." The words hung in the mountain air. The 3 rescuers exchanged glances, and Martha saw skepticism flicker across their faces. Of course they doubted her. An elderly woman claiming her husband had attempted murder sounded like confusion, or shock, or even delusion. The team leader's expression remained neutral as he helped her to her feet. "Let's get you back to solid ground," he said carefully. "The police will want to speak with you about what happened." They guided Martha back along the treacherous section of trail with infinite patience, supporting her when her legs threatened to give out. Once they reached safer terrain, paramedics were waiting with a stretcher, but Martha refused it, insisting she could walk. She needed to walk, needed to feel her own strength, needed to prove to herself that she had survived. The descent took over an hour. By the time they reached the parking area, police vehicles had arrived, along with more emergency personnel. Martha watched as officers cordoned off the area as the recovery team prepared to retrieve Klaus's body from the valley below. Everything was happening with efficient German precision, but it felt surreal, like watching a television show rather than living through her own life. A police detective approached her, a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair and sharp, assessing eyes.
Frau Hoffmann.
I'm Detective Sandra Krauss. I need to ask you some questions about what happened today. Martha nodded, and they sat in the back of an ambulance, while a paramedic cleaned and bandaged her cut palms. Detective Krauss took out a notebook and pen, and Martha told her story from the beginning, starting with the inheritance. Klaus's changed behavior, his insistence on this hike, the moment on the trail when she realized he intended to kill her. She spoke clearly and precisely, leaving nothing out, knowing how it must sound. When she finished, Detective Krauss studied her for a long moment. That's quite an accusation, Frau Hoffmann. It's the truth, Martha said quietly. We'll need to conduct a thorough investigation, the detective replied. In the meantime, I'm afraid you'll need to come to the station for a formal statement. Martha understood what wasn't being said. She wasn't being arrested, not yet, but she was certainly a suspect. In the eyes of the law, she had killed her husband, regardless of the circumstances. Whether it was murder or self-defense would depend entirely on what the investigation revealed, and on whether anyone believed her version of events. The police station in Reutlingen was a modern building with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Martha sat in an interview room with grey walls and a table bolted to the floor, waiting while Detective Krauss reviewed her initial statement. A second detective, an older man named Fischer, sat across from her, his expression unreadable. Martha had been photographed, her injuries documented, her clothing collected as evidence. She now wore a plain sweatsuit provided by the police, and she felt stripped of more than just her hiking clothes. Detective Krauss returned with a folder and a recording device. We're going to go through this again, Frau Hoffmann. Every detail. Take your time, Martha repeated her story, this time with even more precision, describing Klaus's questions about her will, his sudden interest in the inheritance, the way he had researched the trail so carefully. She explained how she had felt uneasy for weeks, how her intuition had screamed warnings she couldn't rationally justify until it was almost too late. The detectives listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, their faces revealing nothing. When she finished, Detective Fischer leaned forward. You claim your husband planned this for weeks, maybe months. Yet you got in the car with him this morning. You hiked for 40 minutes before anything happened. Why didn't you refuse? Why didn't you call for help? It was the question Martha had asked herself 100 times already. Because I had no proof, she said quietly. Only a feeling. How do you accuse someone of planning to murder you based on a feeling? I thought perhaps I was wrong, that I was being paranoid. Until I wasn't wrong. Convenient that he's dead and can't offer his version of events, Fischer said, his tone neutral but the implication clear. Detective Krauss shot him a warning look. We're investigating all possibilities, Frau Hoffmann. We've secured your husband's phone and computer. We'll be examining his recent activities, his searches, his communications. If what you're saying is true, there will be evidence, Martha nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. Klaus had been methodical in his planning. Surely he had left traces, digital footprints that would prove her story. She was driven to a hotel where the police had arranged a room, told not to leave the area, that they would be in contact soon. Martha sat on the edge of the hotel bed, alone for the first time since the morning, and allowed herself to fully break down. She sobbed until her throat was raw, grieving not for the man Klaus had been at the end, but for the illusion of safety she had lost. For the years of her life, she had given to someone who had ultimately seen her as nothing more than an obstacle to wealth. The investigation moved forward with German thoroughness. Klaus's computer yielded its secrets quickly. The forensic team found his search history intact, a damning timeline of premeditation. In the weeks following the inheritance, Klaus had researched German inheritance law extensively, reading dozens of articles about spousal rights and estate distribution. He had visited forums where people discussed ways to contest wills. He had calculated repeatedly what his share would be if Martha died before changing her will, versus if she established the trusts she had mentioned. More disturbing were the searches about hiking accidents, about survival rates from falls at various heights, about how long it took mountain rescue to respond in remote areas. He had researched the specific trail they hiked, studying reviews that mentioned dangerous sections. 2 weeks before the hike, his GPS history showed he had driven to the Swabian Alps alone, a trip he had never mentioned to Martha. Detective Krauss reviewed the evidence with growing certainty. This wasn't a grieving widow making accusations. This was a woman who had barely escaped a carefully planned murder. She called Martha 3 days after the incident. "Can you come to the station? There are some things I need to show you." In the same interview room, Detective Krauss spread printouts across the table. Martha stared at the evidence of her husband's betrayal, rendered in stark black and white. Search terms, calculations, maps with specific locations marked. It was all there, the entire architecture of his plan to kill her. "We also found draft searches he didn't complete," Krauss said quietly. "Questions about how to change someone's will, about forgery, about what happens if someone dies interstate." He was considering multiple approaches, but the hiking accident seemed cleanest to him. Martha felt sick. How long was he planning this? Based on the digital evidence, seriously planning for about 6 weeks. But he was researching inheritance law within days of you receiving news about your uncle's estate. Detective Fisher, who had been skeptical during the first interview, now looked at Martha with something approaching sympathy. "We've also spoken with your daughter. She confirmed that Klaus had been asking her questions about your will, about your plans for the inheritance, in ways that made her uncomfortable. She didn't mention it to you because she thought she might be reading too much into it." Martha closed her eyes. Even her daughter had sensed something wrong. "There's no question this was premeditated," Krauss continued. "The physical evidence from the scene also supports your account. We found scuff marks on the trail consistent with a struggle. Your DNA under Klaus's fingernails where he grabbed you. The rock you struck him with, still at the scene, with his blood and your fingerprints. Everything corroborates self-defense, so I'm not being charged." Martha asked, hardly daring to hope. "The prosecutor's office is still reviewing everything, but I'll be recommending no charges. You defended yourself against an attempted murder." "That's not a crime, Frau Hoffmann. That's survival." Martha felt something break loose in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. She wasn't going to prison. She wasn't going to be punished for refusing to die. The relief was overwhelming, though it did nothing to erase the trauma of what she had endured. "What happens now?" she asked. "You're free to go home whenever you're ready," Krauss said. "Though I'd recommend speaking with a trauma counselor. What you experienced, what you survived, that leaves marks that aren't visible. You'll need support to process this." Martha nodded, already knowing that the hardest part wasn't over. She had survived Klaus's attempt to kill her, had survived the immediate aftermath and investigation. But now she had to survive the rest of her life knowing that the man she married, the man she had trusted and built a life with, had valued money more than her existence. That knowledge would be harder to escape than any physical danger. As she left the police station, stepping out into afternoon sunlight that felt surreal after days of interviews and statements and evidence review, Martha thought about the inheritance that had caused all of this. The money that was supposed to represent freedom and security had nearly cost her everything. She would give it away, she decided, to her daughter, to charities, to anyone but herself. She wanted nothing that carried Klaus's greed as its shadow, but first, she just wanted to go home. Martha's daughter collected her from the hotel the morning after the prosecutor officially declined to press charges. They drove back to Stuttgart in near silence, the kind that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having too much. When they finally spoke, it was of practical things. The apartment would need to be dealt with, Klaus's belongings sorted, funeral arrangements made, though the thought of mourning a man who had tried to kill her felt grotesque to Martha. "You don't have to do any of it," her daughter said firmly as they pulled into the parking garage. "I'll handle everything. You just need to rest and heal." But Martha knew there was no healing without confronting what had happened. She returned to the apartment she had shared with Klaus, walking through rooms that felt like crime scenes of her former life. The kitchen, where he had made her coffee every morning. The living room with its outdated furniture he refused to replace. The bedroom, where she had lain awake sensing danger she couldn't name. Every space held the ghost of who she thought he was, overlapping with the truth of who he had been. She found his notebook in his desk drawer, filled with calculations about the inheritance, about percentages and distribution and timelines. His handwriting, familiar from years of grocery lists and birthday cards, now rendered sinister by its content. There were practice phrases, too, things he had planned to say to the police after her death. She just slipped. I tried to grab her but couldn't reach in time. It happened so fast. One moment she was there and then she was gone. He had scripted his grief before it needed to exist. Martha burned the notebook in the kitchen sink, watching Klaus's careful plans curl and blacken into ash. It changed nothing. The evidence had already been documented by police, but the act felt necessary. A small reclamation of control. The trauma counselor Detective Kraus had recommended turned out to be a woman in her 50s named Dr. Bachmann, who specialized in violent crime survivors. In their first session, Martha sat rigidly on an office couch and said, "I don't know how to feel. Should I be sad he's dead? Relieved? Guilty?" "You can feel all of those things," Dr. Bachmann said gently. "A grief isn't rational, and trauma complicates it further. You lost your husband twice. Once when you discovered his intentions, and again when he died. Both losses are real, even if they conflict with each other." Over the following weeks, Martha began the slow work of processing what she had survived. She learned that her body still carried the memory of that moment on the trail, how her heart would race when she saw hiking boots or heard about the Swabian Alps. She learned that trust, once shattered so completely, doesn't simply rebuild itself. She learned that surviving isn't the same as healing, that she would carry this experience with her always. But it didn't have to define the rest of her life. The inheritance became clearer in her mind as the shock receded. She established trust funds for her grandchildren as she had originally planned. She donated generously to the hospital where she had worked, funding a scholarship program for nursing students from low-income families. She set up an endowment for domestic violence prevention, a cause that took on new meaning after her own experience. The vineyard she sold to a young couple who had been working there for years, offering them favorable terms that honored her uncle's legacy, more than simply liquidating it for maximum profit. For herself, Martha kept only enough to live comfortably but modestly. She moved out of the apartment she had shared with Klaus, finding a smaller place with large windows and a balcony where she grew herbs and flowers. She learned to live alone without loneliness, to distinguish between solitude and isolation. Her daughter visited weekly, and slowly their relationship deepened in ways it hadn't before. They talked honestly now about the marriage, about the signs they had both seen but dismissed, about how easy it is to explain away discomfort when acknowledging it requires difficult action. They talked about Martha's first marriage too, about patterns she had repeated, about how she had learned to value peace over happiness, compliance over self-advocacy. "I spent so much of my life trying to be agreeable," Martha told her daughter one afternoon over coffee. "Being the good wife, the good employee, the good mother. I thought that's what kept me safe. But it almost got me killed." 6 months after Klaus's death, Martha received a letter from one of his sons in Canada. He had learned the full truth of what happened from the police investigation, and he wrote to apologize for his father's actions and for his own absence from Klaus's life. "He changed after my mother died," the letter explained. "He became bitter and obsessed with money in a way he never was before. We kept our distance because it was easier than confronting what he was becoming. I'm sorry you paid the price for our cowardice," Martha wrote back. A short note thanking him for his honesty, but making clear she wanted no ongoing relationship. She had done enough emotional labor for the Weber family. Some bridges, once burned, should stay that way. A year after the incident, Martha returned to the Swabian Alps. Not to the same trail. She wasn't ready for that and might never be. but to a different area, with gentle paths and expansive views. She hiked with a women's group she had joined. 10 women of various ages who met every Sunday for outdoor excursions and coffee afterwards. They knew her story, the broad strokes at least, and they never made her feel fragile or broken because of it. Standing on a safe overlook, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of amber and gold, Martha felt something shift inside her. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but possibility. The future didn't have to be defined by what Klaus had tried to take from her. She could write new stories, build new memories, reclaim the things he had tried to poison. She thought about that moment on the trail when she had fought back, when she had chosen survival over surrender. She had acted on instinct then, but looking back she saw it differently now. It wasn't just instinct. It was every year of her life, every hardship she had endured and overcome, every moment she had been underestimated or dismissed. All of it had prepared her for that split second when everything hung in the balance, when she had to decide whether to live or die. She had chosen to live, and every day since, she chose it again. Martha Hoffman would never fully recover from her husband's betrayal. The scars, physical and emotional, would always be part of her story. But scars were evidence of survival, proof that you could be wounded and still keep breathing, still keep moving forward. She was 68 years old now, and for the first time in her life she belonged entirely to herself. That was worth more than any inheritance.